Everyone in the camp thought Nikola Vukovic was burying his family alive. Not metaphorically. They watched him drag warped boiler plates across the gravel at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo range, toward a dark horizontal slit under a sandstone shelf. The opening was barely tall enough for a man to stand inside. From the valley, it looked less like a building site and more like the mouth of an animal den. A teamster named Gideon Hart stopped his wagon and stared. Nikola, a narrow-shouldered Dalmatian stone man with dust in his beard and a miner's patience in his hands, was hauling the iron downhill instead of up. The other settler in the San Luis Valley was raising walls, stacking logs, trying to get a roof above the weather before winter found them. Nikola was doing the opposite. He was taking his house into the hill. Amos Bell, the best carpenter within 40 miles, crossed his arms and shook his head. "He says he is building a room," Amos said. "But a room has 4 walls and a roof. That thing is a hole with a door." Gideon squinted at the iron plates lying beside the rock. "That shelf will sweat him out in spring," he said, "or drop on him when the frost opens it." A rancher laughed under his breath. "No, it will do worse. It will keep just long enough for his wife to trust it." That was the verdict. Nikola Vukovic had survived quarry blasts, ship holds, and railroad cuts, only to come west and lose his mind at the base of a cliff. He had no proper timber frame, no proud roofline, no square cabin standing against the sky, just a low stone mouth, a pile of rejected iron, and a plan that looked like cowardice to men who believed survival meant facing the wind head on. But that winter, when the valley froze so hard that boot leather cracked indoors and men burned fence rails for heat, the strangest house in the settlement became the only room where ink stayed liquid. I'm going to show you how a man with almost no carpentry skill built the warmest shelter in the valley by understanding 2 things the experts missed: moving air and the slow heat of stone. Because Nikola did not beat the storm by building stronger walls, he beat it by stepping where the storm could not reach. Nikola Vukovic was not a house builder. He had never been trusted with finish work, never cut a clean window frame, never made a door that hung right on the first try. His knowledge came from a rougher school. As a boy on the Dalmatian coast, he had followed older men into limestone cuts where the earth kept the same cool breath in August and January. Later, in America, he worked railroad grades and mine tunnels, reading rock with a hammer tap, knowing by sound when stone was hollow, rotten, locked, or safe. He knew how frost entered cracks. He knew how water carried danger. He knew that a mountain could kill a careless man without shifting enough for the eye to notice. But he also knew something most valley men did not. Rock was not only weight. Rock was memory. It remembered summer after the leaves fell. It remembered the average of many days when the air above it went mad. A few feet behind the face of a hill, temperature changed slowly, reluctantly, almost stubbornly. It did not panic with the weather. Nikola had come to Colorado with his wife, Annika, and their 2 children, Luca and Mira, believing the high valley would give them what the camps never had: land, room, and a future that did not smell of blasting powder. Their first winter nearly broke that belief. The cabin they rented had been called good enough by every man who saw it. Pine logs, mud chinking, a shake roof, a little stove in the corner. To Nikola, it looked honest. To Annika, it looked like a blessing. Then the wind began. It came down from the passes with a dry, cutting force that did not feel like weather. Felt like something searching for entry. It found gaps behind the stovepipe. It found seams between logs. It pressed under the door so steadily that the ashes in the stove shifted when no one touched them. At night, the children slept with caps on. Annika woke before dawn to break a skin of ice from the water pail with the handle of a spoon. Once, Nikola found the ink in Luca's school bottle frozen into a black pebble. Another morning, a damp shirt left near the wall stood stiff as bark. The worst sign was not the cold itself. It was the movement. The stove could heat air. It could not keep it. Every armload of cedar Nikola carried inside became a brief pocket of warmth. And then the wind stole that pocket through 1,000 invisible thefts. The cabin was not simply losing heat through its walls. It was being drained. Warm air left through the high cracks. Cold air was pulled in through the low ones. The house breathed like a wounded animal. And every breath cost wood. The men in the valley thought the answer was better craft, tighter joints, thicker logs, more mud, a bigger stove. Nikola watched the flame in their rented cabin lean sideways on calm-looking nights and understood that the problem was not only insulation. The problem was pressure. A wall can slow cold. It cannot argue with moving air forever. When winter ended, the Vukovic family had used more wood than they could afford, lost 2 hens, and sold 1 milk goat to pay a debt at the store. Annika did not complain. That made it worse. In April, while other men were choosing cabin sites near the road, Nikola walked the lower slopes with a hammer, a candle, and a length of string. He was looking for a place that already had what a carpenter would spend a lifetime trying to make. A windbreak no storm could tear down, and a mass no frost could hurry. He found it under a sandstone bench on the east side of a dry wash. The ledge had been carved by centuries of wind and flash water into a shallow hollow, open to the south, closed to the north, with solid stone overhead and packed earth behind it. The opening was not deep enough to be a cave. It was too low and ugly for anyone to want. That was why Nikola wanted it. For 8 days he sounded the rock. Tap, listen, tap, listen. Amos Bell came up the slope on the 4th day and watched him. "You planning to ask that wall for permission?" Amos said. Nikola kept listening to the echo. "Yes," he said. Amos laughed because he thought it was a joke. It was not. Nikola rejected 2 spots where the hammer note came back dull. Trench above the shelf to steer water away before it could reach the hollow. He cut another drain along the floor, pitched just enough that spring melt would leave before it could soak the room. He stacked flat stones into a short inner wall, leaving a handspan gap between the living space and the earth. That gap mattered. He did not want damp soil touching his bed. He wanted still air touching warm stone. The boilerplates came from a failed smelter outside Alamosa. They were dented, blackened, and too bent for the men who owned them. Nikola bought them for almost nothing. To the valley, the plates looked like scrap. To Nikola, they were a shell. He slid them under the ledge one by one on greased skids and braced them with short cedar posts. Over the iron he packed stone chips and clay, then more earth, until the roof vanished into the slope. From outside, the house was becoming less visible every day. That offended people more than they admitted. A frontier house was supposed to declare itself. It stood upright. It showed that a man had arrived, claimed a square of land, and dared the weather to come take it. Nikola's shelter did not declare anything. It disappeared. And at the mouth of the hollow, where the mountain stopped and the weather began, he built the only part that looked like a home, a thick front wall of rough pine planks, doubled with sawdust between them. The door was low. The 2 windows were small and set deep, each with a second pane he had traded 3 weeks of stonework to obtain. A stovepipe ran through the iron shell and up the rock face, fastened by spikes driven into drilled holes. The result looked poor from the road, a wooden face under a stone brow, a house with no roof, a home that had retreated. Annika stood outside it the evening before they moved in, holding Mira's hand. "It feels like going back into the old work," she said. Nikola knew what she meant. The dark, the stone overhead, the memory of men buried in cuts that should have held. He did not dismiss her fear. He took the lamp inside, set it on the floor, and opened the door. The little flame did not lean. It stood straight. "Not a mine," he said quietly. "A Lee." Then he placed her hand against the back wall. The stone was cool, but not cruel. It did not bite the skin the way January air did. It simply waited. The valley waited too. It waited for damp to ruin them, for a crack to open, for smoke to back up, for shame to drive them into a real cabin. Instead, November came, then December, then the wind. It started at dusk, with a white line of dust crawling along the valley floor. Midnight, the sky was clear and savage. No snow fell, but old snow lifted from the ground and flew sideways in dry ribbons. Fence wire sang. Roof shakes clattered like teeth. Horses turned their backs to the gusts and stood trembling. By morning, the temperature had fallen so far that milk froze in a pail beside a stove at the Pike Ranch. For 6 days, the wind did not rest. It pressed on the valley cabins until their walls clicked and moaned. It found the places where men had been proud of their joinery and made those places whistle. In the bell cabin, frost appeared around nail heads on the inside wall, each nail conducting the outside inward like a tiny, cold needle. At Gideon Hart's place, the stove drew badly because the wind punched down the chimney, filling the room with smoke every time the door opened. People stopped talking about comfort. They talked about wood, how much remained, which pile was nearest, which rail could be burned without losing stock, which neighbor had gone silent. Inside the Vukovic room, the storm existed mostly as sound. A low-pressure hum reached them through the stone, not loud enough to frighten the children, only strange enough to remind them that the world outside was being scraped clean. The lamp flame remained upright. The thermometer Nikola had nailed near the back wall never dropped below 51 degrees before the stove was lit. With a modest fire, the room rose into the 60s and stayed there long after the last coal faded. Annika baked flatbread on the 3rd day of the storm, not because she was trying to prove anything, because the dough rose. Luca sat at the table with his copybook, dipping his pen into ink that moved freely in the bottle. Mira played with a wooden sheep on the floor. The children did not wear mittens indoors. That was the real miracle of the room, not that it was hot. It did not need to be hot. It began from mercy. The outside air was below zero and moving like a blade. The world immediately behind Nikola's walls was still, dark, and held near the temperature of the earth itself. His stove was not asked to lift a frozen box from death to life. It only had to lift a sheltered room from cool to human. The difference was everything. On the 7th morning, Gideon Hart climbed the slope because he expected to find trouble. He had seen too many clever ideas fail in bad weather. He had also said too much about Nikola's shelter to let the matter rest. If the Vukovic family needed help, he would help them. If they were dead, he would be one of the men who carried them out. The wind struck him sideways as he crossed the open wash. Ice dust stung his eyes. He kept his head down until he reached the sandstone shelf. Then, in 3 steps, the world changed. The roar fell away, not faded, not softened, stopped. A strip of red cloth Annika had tied beside the door hung perfectly limp. Gideon stood there breathing hard, confused by the absence of violence. 20 feet behind him, the valley wind was tearing at brush and throwing snow like sand. In front of Nikola's door, the air rested. The door opened before he knocked. Warmth came out, not in a blast, but as a steady human breath. Gideon saw the family at breakfast. He saw no frost on the inside planks, no smoke hanging in the room, no children hunched under blankets. He saw Annika lift a pan from the stove with bare hands wrapped in a cloth. He saw Luca close an ink bottle. And on the wall near the back, he saw the thermometer. 58 degrees. Gideon stepped inside and turned slowly. The room was not handsome. The roof was low. The walls bore tool marks. The floor was stone and packed earth, swept clean but plain. It would never impress a carpenter. But it was alive in a way the square cabins were not. It held. Gideon touched the rear stonework and expected winter to bite through it. Instead, he felt a cool steadiness, like water drawn from a deep well. Nikola watched him understand. Not all at once. Men rarely surrender certainty in a single instant. Gideon's face changed piece by piece. First, suspicion. Then measurement, then embarrassment, then respect. "You didn't build against the wind," Gideon said. Nikola shook his head. "No." Gideon looked toward the door, where the red cloth still hung motionless. "You made the wind miss." Nikola smiled at that. "The hill made it miss. I only put the room where the hill was already working." That sentence traveled farther than Nikola expected. Gideon Hart was not sentimental, but he was responsible for freight sheds, line huts, and men who could die between stations when weather turned. 2 weeks after the storm, he wrote a practical note for a stockman's circular. He did not describe Nikola as a genius. He did not call the shelter beautiful. He did not try to make poetry out of stone. He wrote the principle plainly. Do not place a winter shelter where the wind can test every seam. Place it where the land breaks the wind first. Do not trust timber alone to hold a temperature. Couple the room to earth or stone, but drain it, separate it from damp, and keep the inner air still. He included a rough sketch of the Vukovic shelter. Ledge above, earth behind, iron shell, air gap, drain trench, low front wall.